Bill Callahan froze mid-step, his walking stick suspended in air as the sound reached his ears, a guttural whimper unlike anything he'd heard since Saigon. Blood spattered the undergrowth like crimson rain. It wasn't an animal dying, it was a soldier hanging on. The German shepherd lay sprawled against fallen oak leaves, her amber eyes meeting his with primal recognition. Her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps, yet when Bill moved closer, she bared her teeth, not in aggression, but in warning. Behind her, barely visible beneath a rotting log, tiny movements betrayed what she was protecting. 18 months since Margaret's passing, and Bill hadn't felt anything but numb, yet something in the dog's desperate defiance cracked open the vault of his heart. "Easy, girl," he whispered, his trembling hand reaching slowly forward as memories of another loyal companion flooded back. Who would reach this dying mother in time? And in that moment, as their eyes met, Bill couldn't tell who needed saving more. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The cabin sat nestled among ancient oaks at the end of a winding dirt road that turned to mud with the slightest rain. Bill Callahan had called this patch of the Arkansas Ozarks home for the past 3 years, ever since the VA benefits barely covered Margaret's final medical bills, and they'd lost the house in Springfield. His grandfather, a stern-faced World War II veteran whose Bronze Star hung beside the mantel, had left the hunting cabin to Bill with one condition: don't sell it to strangers. These days, Bill understood the old man's desire for solitude better than ever. At 67, Staff Sergeant William Callahan, retired, moved with the deliberate precision of a man who'd learned the hard way that carelessness costs lives. His once powerful frame had grown leaner, but the military posture remained, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes constantly scanning. Only his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly when memories ambushed him from the dark corners of his mind. The cabin's interior told the story of a life interrupted. Dust gathered on Margaret's collection of bird figurines. Her faded blue armchair remained untouched, while Bill slept on a worn recliner most nights. The television stayed off, the silence preferable to the constant barrage of a world that had moved on without him. Prescription bottles lined the kitchen counter, the VA's answer to the nightmares that had haunted him since Da Nang. On the small oak desk by the window, next to the rotary phone that rarely rang, sat a half-finished letter. "To whom it may concern," it began in Bill's precise handwriting. He'd started it 3 times now, never quite finding the right words to explain the inexplicable. How a man could survive war only to be defeated by Tuesday mornings and empty chairs at the dinner table. His son Thomas had visited twice since the funeral. The conversations strained, filled with Thomas's well-meaning but hollow suggestions about senior communities and being closer to proper medical care. His granddaughter Sarah called every Sunday without fail, her voice the single bright note in his week. She'd send photos from veterinary school, her passion for healing animals reminiscent of another life when Bill had been handler to Ajax, the best damn tracking dog in the entire unit until that final patrol. The walls held the evidence of a decorated career, photographs of younger men with arms slung over shoulders, service medals in shadow boxes, and a folded flag in a triangular case. But there were gaps in the chronology, years Bill refused to document. "Some things aren't meant to be remembered," he'd told Thomas during their last argument. Outside, dark clouds gathered over the ridgeline as the morning's weather radio report warned of an approaching storm system. 3 days' worth of canned goods sat on the counter beside fresh batteries for the flashlights. Bill had been preparing for storms his entire life. It was surviving the calm that had proven impossible. Bill's morning had begun like any other. Coffee brewed strong enough to stand a spoon in it, 2 pieces of toast with Margaret's blackberry jam running dangerously low now, and the weather radio crackling with static as the announcer's voice warned of an approaching system. Heavy rainfall expected throughout the Ozarks region, possible flash flooding in low-lying areas. Residents advised to secure loose items and prepare for potential power outages. He tucked the half-finished letter into his desk drawer, deciding today wasn't the day after all. Some tasks required a clarity he couldn't seem to muster. Instead, he'd pulled on his worn field jacket, faded olive drab with patches removed but their outlines still visible, and decided to check his property line before the storm hit. Fallen branches from the last wind needed clearing from the creek. Otherwise, the runoff would back up and flood the east side of his land. The walking stick he'd carved from hickory thumped against the earth as he made his way down the familiar trail. His left knee, with its souvenir shrapnel from '71, protested each uneven step. The morning air carried the metallic scent of approaching rain, and birds had gone suspiciously quiet. Nature's warning system more reliable than any weather service. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not quite a bark, not fully a whimper, something in between, filled with pain and desperation. Bill stopped, head tilting slightly as he focused his hearing the way his old drill sergeant had taught him. There. Southeast, maybe 200 yards through the underbrush. Against his better judgment, he veered off the path, pushing through dense foliage that clawed at his sleeves. The blood trail appeared first, dark splashes on green leaves that made his stomach clench with memories. He followed it mechanically, old training kicking in as his eyes scanned for signs of movement or threat. When he finally found the source, the sight stopped him cold. The German shepherd lay partially concealed under a fallen log, her tan and black coat matted with blood around her hind leg. A metal trap, unlike any hunting device Bill recognized, had clamped around her lower leg. Not a standard animal trap. This was something else, with serrated edges that seemed designed to prevent escape rather than make a clean capture. The dog's attempts to free herself had only worsened the damage. As Bill approached, the dog's lips pulled back in a warning snarl, but her eyes held more fear than aggression. Those eyes, amber with flecks of gold, held an intelligence that struck him immediately. This was no ordinary stray. "Easy now," Bill murmured, using the same calm tone he'd once reserved for skittish recruits and nervous tracking dogs. "I'm not gonna hurt you, girl." He crouched, keeping his movements slow and telegraphed. The dog watched him warily, her breathing labored. It was then Bill noticed the swollen teats beneath her emaciated frame. A nursing mother, separated from her pups. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Where are your babies, girl?" he asked softly, eyes scanning the surrounding area. No sign of puppies, but they couldn't be far. A nursing mother wouldn't voluntarily stray from her litter. The trap presented the immediate problem. Bill recognized the design now. It wasn't meant for animals at all. This was anti-personnel equipment, military grade, modified to look more like a game trap, the kind of thing he'd encountered in another life, another jungle. What the hell was it doing in the Arkansas Ozarks? A distant rumble of thunder punctuated his thoughts. The storm was approaching faster than forecast, and making decisions in the field had always been Bill's strength. Leave the dog and both she and her puppies would die. Attempt to help, and he risked a defensive bite from a wounded, frightened animal. "All right," he decided, shrugging off his pack. "Let's get you out of there first." From his pack, Bill retrieved a multi-tool and a worn first aid kit, relics of a preparedness that Margaret had once teased him about but never discouraged. The trap's mechanism was unfamiliar, but the principle remained the same. He would need to compress the spring to release the jaws. "This is gonna hurt," he warned the dog, who watched him with wary resignation. "But I'm trying to help." As Bill reached toward the trap, his hands trembled. Not from age or the morning's coffee, but from something deeper. A flash of memory, another animal, another injury, another time when his hands had needed to be steady. Ajax's dark eyes looking up at him as the field medic worked frantically to stem the bleeding from the wound that would ultimately take him. The German shepherd growled low in her throat as Bill's fingers neared the trap, but she didn't snap. Something in her seemed to understand his intent, or perhaps she was simply too weak to fight. Up close, Bill could see the military precision of her ear tattoo, mostly obscured by dried blood, but unmistakably there. This was no ordinary stray. This was a trained dog. The trap's release mechanism finally yielded to his efforts with a metallic snap that made the dog flinch. The pressure released, but the damage was extensive. Blood flowed freely now, and Bill quickly applied pressure with a bandana from his pocket. "You're a military girl, aren't you?" he murmured, examining what he could see of the tattoo. "Who lost track of you, I wonder?" The first fat raindrops began to fall through the canopy above, spattering against leaves and skin alike. The storm was nearly upon them, and Bill made his decision. With careful movements, he fashioned a makeshift tourniquet above the wound, then removed his jacket to create a carrying sling. "I'm going to pick you up now," he warned. "Don't bite me if you can help it." The dog tensed as Bill slid his arms beneath her, but offered no resistance beyond a pained whine. She was lighter than she should have been, her ribs prominent beneath the once glossy coat. As he lifted, her head fell against his chest in a gesture of either trust or complete exhaustion. Bill couldn't tell which. Thunder cracked overhead as Bill began the arduous journey back to his cabin, the wounded shepherd cradled against him. The rain intensified, turning the forest floor treacherous underfoot. His knee screamed in protest with each careful step, but a curious calm had settled over him, the familiar clarity of purpose that had been missing for too long. "We'll find your puppies," he promised the dog, who watched him through half-lidded eyes. "But first, we need to stop this bleeding." By the time the cabin came into view, both man and dog were soaked to the skin. Bill shouldered open the door and carried his charge directly to the kitchen table, the only surface with enough light for what needed doing. Margaret would have had a fit seeing an animal on her good oak table, but some emergencies transcended household rules. The dog lay unnervingly still as Bill gathered supplies: clean towels, the better first aid kit from the bathroom, a bottle of Kentucky bourbon for sterilization and courage in equal measure, and the sewing kit Margaret had left behind. Field medicine wasn't pretty, but it was better than bleeding out. "This is gonna hurt like hell," Bill warned as he cleaned the wound with bourbon. The dog flinched, but remained stoically silent, another sign of her training. The trap had torn muscle and likely nicked an artery, but miraculously seemed to have missed the major tendons. With steady hands that surprised him, Bill began the meticulous work of stitching the worst of the damage. Outside, the storm intensified, rain hammering against the tin roof and wind howling through the trees. The power flickered once, twice, then surrendered to the inevitable, plunging the cabin into midday twilight. Bill paused only long enough to light the kerosene lamp Margaret had insisted on keeping for character. "At least she was right about something," he muttered to the dog, who watched him with eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond animal capacity. With the worst of the bleeding controlled and the wound bandaged, Bill finally allowed himself to examine the ear tattoo more thoroughly. Cleaning away the dried blood revealed a sequence of characters he recognized immediately, a military identification system for working dogs. This animal had served just as he had. "Well, soldier," Bill said quietly, stroking the damp fur of her neck, "seems we've both seen better days." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the table in response, the first voluntary movement since he'd found her. A good sign, but they weren't out of the woods yet. Dehydration and infection remained immediate threats, and somewhere out there, puppies waited for a mother who might never return. Bill filled a bowl with water and placed it near the dog's muzzle. She drank greedily, confirming his suspicion of dehydration. When she'd had her fill, he carefully lifted her once more, this time to Margaret's blue armchair, the one piece of furniture he'd kept pristine since her passing. She'd understand, he told the dog as he settled her onto the cushion. Margaret always had a soft spot for strays, human or otherwise. As if in response to the name, the dog's ears perked slightly. Bill paused, a strange sensation creeping up his spine. "Margaret?" he tried again, watching closely. The dog's tail moved in weak acknowledgement. Bill sat heavily on the footstool, mind racing. It couldn't be coincidence. Either this dog had been trained to respond to that name, or the realization hit him with the force of memory. 3 years ago, before Margaret's diagnosis, they'd watched a news segment about military working dogs. One in particular, a female German shepherd who'd saved her entire unit during an ambush, had caught Margaret's attention. "That's what bravery looks like, Bill," she'd said. "They named her Mercy because she showed none to the enemy, but gave everything to save her people." Bill stared at the wounded animal before him, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. "Mercy?" he whispered. The dog's head lifted immediately, eyes suddenly alert despite her exhaustion. "Sweet Jesus," Bill breathed. "You're supposed to be dead." Bill's hands trembled as he searched through the stack of newspapers he kept in a wooden crate beside the fireplace. Margaret had always chided him for his inability to throw out old news, but now he was grateful for the habit. Somewhere in this pile was confirmation of what he already knew in his gut. There it was, dated nearly 2 years ago. The headline was small, buried on page 3. "Military working dog killed in training accident." The accompanying photo showed a German shepherd with the same distinctive white patch on her chest that the dog on Margaret's chair possessed. The article was brief, mentioning only that Mercy, a decorated K-9 with multiple combat deployments, had died during a routine exercise at Fort Campbell. No details were provided, out of respect for the handler's privacy. "That's a load of horse manure if I ever heard it," Bill muttered, scanning the article again. Training accidents happened, but they weren't typically shrouded in such secrecy. And they certainly didn't result in dogs showing up in the Ozarks wilderness with military-grade traps attached to their legs. Lightning flashed outside, followed almost immediately by a thunderclap that rattled the windows. The storm was directly overhead now. Bill's landline phone emitted a sharp electronic squeal before going dead. The lines were down. He was on his own, as he had been so many times before. The dog, Mercy, watched him with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Her breathing had steadied, but her condition remained precarious. The wound, though cleaned and stitched, could still become infected without proper antibiotics. The closest veterinary clinic was in Mountain Home, at least 30 miles of treacherous mountain roads away, impossible in this weather. Bill moved to his medicine cabinet, taking inventory of what might help. Half a bottle of amoxicillin from his last tooth infection, some wound cleaning supplies, and basic painkillers. Not ideal for a dog, but perhaps enough to buy some time. His training as a combat medic had included basic veterinary care for military working dogs, a necessity when operating far from support. "This isn't exactly by the book," he told Mercy as he carefully calculated dosages based on her estimated weight. "But then again, neither of us seems to be following the official story, are we?" As he crushed a partial dose of antibiotic into a spoonful of peanut butter, Bill's mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. A dog reported dead, but very much alive. A military-grade trap in civilian woods. The elaborate tattoo in her ear that marked her as government property. Something wasn't right, and decades of military service had taught Bill to trust his instincts. Mercy accepted the medication-laced peanut butter cautiously. Then, with increasing enthusiasm, probably the first proper food she'd had in days. While she ate, Bill examined the trap he'd brought back, now sitting on his kitchen counter like a malevolent sculpture. The device was similar to those he'd encountered during his later tours in Vietnam, designed specifically to maim rather than kill, to create a casualty burden on the enemy. But this one had modifications he didn't recognize, serrated edges on the interior of the jaws, and what appeared to be a small electronic component fused to one side, now damaged beyond recognition. "What were you mixed up in, girl?" he murmured, setting the trap aside. The question that troubled him more was, who had set it, and why? The storm continued its assault on the cabin, rain hammering against the roof like machine gun fire. Bill found himself instinctively hunching his shoulders at each thunderclap, his body remembering another time when loud noises meant danger. From Margaret's chair, Mercy whined softly, as if in sympathy or shared understanding. Bill's gaze drifted to the half-finished letter in his desk drawer. How different this day had begun, with thoughts of endings rather than mysteries. The irony wasn't lost on him. A particularly violent gust of wind sent something crashing against the porch, and Mercy's reaction was immediate. Despite her injuries, she struggled to rise, a low growl building in her throat as she stared intently at the door. Her posture shifted from wounded animal to protector in an instant, ears forward, muscles tensed. "Easy, girl," Bill soothed, moving instinctively to check the windows. Nothing visible through the rain-streaked glass except the swaying trees and his old pickup truck, now barely visible through the downpour. Yet Mercy remained alert, focused on something beyond his perception. Bill retrieved his shotgun from the closet, a habit born of decades living alone in remote areas rather than any real expectation of danger. But today, with an allegedly dead military dog in his living room, caution seemed warranted. Another crash from the porch, and this time Bill could make out a fallen branch that had torn loose from the old oak. False alarm. But Mercy remained vigilant, her attention now fixed on the window rather than the door. Following her gaze, Bill noticed something he'd missed. A faint beam of light moving through the trees beyond his property line. Too steady to be lightning, too directed to be a reflection. Someone was out there in the storm, carrying a flashlight or headlamp. Could be a hiker caught in the weather, Bill reasoned aloud, though he didn't believe it. His property bordered national forest land, but few hikers ventured this far off the marked trails, especially with a storm forecasted. Mercy's growl deepened, confirming his suspicion that whoever was out there wasn't a lost tourist. Military dogs were trained to remain calm around friendlies. This reaction suggested otherwise. Bill dimmed the kerosene lamp and moved away from the windows, old instincts resurfacing with surprising clarity. His mind rapidly assessed the situation. Isolated location, communication lines down, unknown hostiles potentially searching the area, and a wounded military asset in his care. The scenario was disturbingly familiar, though the Ozark Mountains had replaced Vietnamese jungles. "We've got company," he told Mercy quietly, "and I'm guessing they're not here to return you to your unit." As if understanding perfectly, Mercy stopped growling but remained alert, her eyes never leaving the window. Bill was struck by how quickly they'd fallen into a partnership, two veterans recognizing each other across species. The light outside disappeared, either extinguished or temporarily obscured by the dense foliage. Bill used the opportunity to gather essentials: his hunting knife, a flashlight, extra ammunition for the shotgun, and a first aid kit. If someone was looking for Mercy, they'd eventually make their way to the cabin, the only human habitation for miles, but there was a more pressing concern. Somewhere out there were Mercy's puppies, vulnerable and alone. If she'd been trapped while trying to return to them, they'd been without their mother for at least a day, possibly longer. "We need to find your babies," Bill told her, making a decision. "Before they do—" Mercy's ears perked at his words, and she made another attempt to stand, whining when her injured leg wouldn't support her weight. "You're staying put," Bill said firmly. "I'll find them, but I need to know where to look." For a moment he felt foolish talking to the dog as if she could understand complex ideas. Then he remembered his training with military canines and their sophisticated communication abilities. These weren't ordinary animals. They understood far more than most people gave them credit for. Bill pulled out a county survey map from his desk drawer and spread it on the floor where Mercy could see it. "Old school, I know," he told her, "but sometimes analog is best." He pointed to the location of his cabin. "We're here. I found you about a half-mile southeast here." His finger traced the approximate location. "Where are your puppies? Can you show me?" Mercy studied the map with an intensity that would have seemed comical in any other circumstance. Then, with deliberate effort, she pawed at a section of the map representing a dry creek bed about a quarter-mile from where Bill had found her. Bill stared at her in astonishment. He'd worked with intelligent military dogs before, but this level of comprehension was extraordinary. Either that, or he was projecting meaning onto random canine behavior, a possibility his rational mind couldn't discount. "The old storm drain by Miller's Creek?" he asked. The area had once been part of a flood control system before the Corps of Engineers had redirected the main waterway. Now it was mostly abandoned infrastructure, concrete tunnels that ran beneath parts of the forest floor. Mercy's tail thumped against the chair in what seemed like confirmation. "Smart girl," Bill murmured, folding the map and tucking it into his jacket pocket. "That's good defensive positioning. Elevated entrance, multiple exit points, easy to defend." He was analyzing it like a military installation, which perhaps wasn't far from how Mercy had assessed it for her puppy's safety. The storm showed no signs of abating, but waiting wasn't an option. If the puppies were in that drain system and the rain continued, flooding was a real possibility. And if whoever was searching the woods found them first— Bill didn't complete the thought. Instead, he moved efficiently around the cabin, preparing for a rescue mission he'd never anticipated when he woke that morning. He found a small, collapsible carrier Margaret had used for their last cat, lined it with a towel, and packed a bag with supplies that might help cold, hungry puppies: a hot water bottle, some clean rags, and a mixture of warm water and the last of Margaret's powdered milk. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he told Mercy, who watched his preparations with anxious eyes. "You rest and guard the fort." Before leaving, Bill paused at his desk drawer. The half-finished letter sat where he'd left it that morning, its purpose now seeming distant and foreign. Without reading it again, he tore it into small pieces and dropped them into the fireplace. Whatever happened next, that particular ending was no longer in consideration. Outside, the rain hammered against him with physical force, instantly soaking through his jacket despite the rain gear he'd donned. Visibility was poor, but Bill knew these woods better than anyone, had walked them in grief and remembrance for 3 years, learning every root and rock by heart. He moved cautiously, senses heightened to any sign of the mysterious light-bearer. The shotgun was an uncomfortable weight against his shoulder, necessary but troubling. It had been decades since he'd carried a weapon with the expectation of potentially using it against another human being. The creek bed was swollen with rainwater, turning what was normally a gentle trickle into a rushing torrent. Bill picked his way along the edge, searching for the concrete outflow pipe that marked the entrance to the old drainage system. Lightning provided sporadic illumination, the landscape transforming from pitch black to stark white and back again in instants. During one such flash, Bill caught sight of what he was looking for: the circular opening of the storm drain, partially obscured by vegetation but unmistakable once spotted. He also saw something else: fresh boot prints in the mud leading toward the same destination. Someone had been here recently, within hours. Bill's pulse quickened as military training took over. He extinguished his flashlight and moved forward, using only the intermittent lightning to guide him. The shotgun now held ready, he approached the drain entrance from an angle, using the surrounding vegetation as cover. The opening was larger than he remembered, about 4 feet in diameter, plenty large enough for a German shepherd to enter and exit comfortably. Bill listened intently, but the sound of rain and rushing water made it impossible to detect any subtle noises from within. Taking a deep breath, he switched his flashlight to its lowest setting and directed the beam into the concrete tunnel. The light revealed nothing immediately alarming, just the curved walls of the pipe extending about 20 feet before making a sharp turn. On the concrete floor, barely visible, were the distinct paw prints of a large dog, confirming Mercy had indeed used this as her den. Bill entered cautiously, bent nearly double to clear the opening. The air inside was damp but slightly warmer than outside, the concrete providing some insulation from the storm. As he moved deeper, the sounds of rain receded, replaced by the echo of water dripping from his clothes onto the concrete floor. At the bend in the tunnel, Bill paused, listening intently. The faintest whimpering sound reached his ears, a sound he recognized immediately from his days as a handler. Puppy vocalizations, multiple sources, they were alive. Rounding the corner with his light held low to avoid startling them, Bill found himself in a wider junction where several drainage pipes converged. In the center, nestled in what appeared to be a carefully arranged bed of leaves and what looked suspiciously like material torn from a military rucksack, lay 4 German shepherd puppies, no more than a few weeks old. 3 of the puppies huddled together for warmth, their tiny bodies trembling. The 4th lay slightly apart, its breathing shallow and labored. All showed signs of hunger and distress, but miracle of miracles, they were alive. "Hello there, little soldiers," Bill whispered, holstering his weapon and setting down his supplies. "Let's get you back to your mama." As he prepared to gather the puppies, his flashlight beam caught something else, something that made his blood run cold. Partially buried in the nest material was a small black notebook with a distinctive emblem embossed on its cover: the insignia of military intelligence. Bill reached for it with suddenly unsteady hands, knowing instantly that whatever was contained within was the real reason someone was searching these woods in a thunderstorm. Whatever Mercy had been involved in, it was bigger, and likely far more dangerous, than a simple training accident cover-up. And now, for better or worse, Bill Callahan was involved too. The journey back to the cabin was a battle against both elements and time. Bill had tucked the small black notebook inside his jacket, close to his skin where it would stay dry. The 4 puppies were secured in the collapsible carrier, which he'd covered with his outer layer for additional protection from the relentless rain. The smallest pup, worryingly lethargic, he'd placed inside his shirt against his chest, hoping his body heat would stabilize the tiny creature. Every few yards, Bill paused to scan his surroundings, all too aware of the mysterious searcher he'd glimpsed earlier. The shotgun, awkward to carry while managing the puppy carrier, remained within immediate reach. He avoided the most direct path back to his cabin, instead taking a circuitous route that utilized the natural cover of the forest and minimized his exposure on open ground. The rain had turned the forest floor into treacherous terrain, each step requiring careful consideration. Twice Bill nearly lost his footing on the slick hillside, the weight of his precious cargo making balance all the more difficult. His knee screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain with the single-minded determination that had once carried him through 72 hours behind enemy lines with a wounded comrade on his back. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed immediately by thunder that vibrated through the ground beneath his feet. The smallest puppy stirred against his chest, letting out a pitiful whimper that twisted something deep in Bill's heart. "Hang on, little bit," he murmured. "We're almost there." As the cabin finally came into view through the curtain of rain, Bill performed one final perimeter check before making his approach. Nothing seemed amiss. No strange vehicles, no lights where there shouldn't be, no sign of intrusion. Still, the heightened awareness of potential danger remained, a familiar companion from another life. Mercy's reaction when Bill entered was immediate and profound. Despite her injuries, she struggled to rise, whining urgently at the sight of the carrier. Bill quickly brought the puppies to her, setting the carrier on the floor beside Margaret's chair, where the mother could see her offspring. "Easy does it," Bill cautioned as he opened the carrier. "They're okay, but this little one needs extra attention." The three stronger puppies tumbled out in a heap of wet fur and excited whimpers, immediately finding their way to their mother's side. Mercy sniffed each one thoroughly, her tail weakly thumping against the chair cushion in what could only be described as relief. She licked them frantically, cleaning away the dirt and dampness of their ordeal while simultaneously checking for injuries. Bill carefully extracted the smallest puppy from inside his shirt. The tiny creature's eyes were closed, its breathing shallow but steady. "This one's had a rough go of it," he told Mercy, gently placing the pup against her belly near a teat. With gentle guidance, he helped the weakened puppy find its food source, nodding with satisfaction when it began to nurse. For several minutes, Bill simply watched the reunion, a lump forming in his throat that he couldn't quite explain away. There was something profoundly moving about the scene, the injured mother's devotion, the puppy's trust, the simple miracle of survival against considerable odds. The moment was interrupted by a sound outside, subtle enough that most would have missed it, but to Bill's trained ear, unmistakable. The deliberate placement of a boot on his porch step, trying but failing to be silent. Mercy's head lifted sharply, her attention divided now between her puppies and the new threat. A low growl built in her throat, but Bill silenced her with a hand signal that she recognized and obeyed instantly, further confirmation of her military training. Moving silently to the window, Bill peered through a small gap in the curtains. The porch appeared empty, but the rain had momentarily slackened and he could make out fresh boot prints leading up to his door. Someone had approached, then withdrawn, perhaps after hearing movement inside. Bill retrieved his shotgun and moved to a defensive position with clear sight lines to both the front door and the rear exit. The familiar calm of combat readiness settled over him, pushing aside the pain in his knee and the exhaustion of the day's events. He'd been in worse situations with far less preparation. "Stay with your puppies," he instructed Mercy quietly. "I'll handle this." For nearly 20 minutes, Bill held his position, listening intently for any sound that might reveal the visitor's location or intentions. Nothing came except the steady drumming of rain, now intensifying again as the storm system circled back. Eventually, satisfied that the immediate threat had passed, Bill relaxed his stance slightly and turned his attention to the mysterious notebook. The water-resistant cover had protected its contents admirably. Inside, Bill found what appeared to be field notes written in a tight, precise hand. Locations, dates, names, some circled, others crossed out. Several pages contained what looked like coordinates, while others held cryptic references to shipments and transactions. Nothing explicitly incriminating, But the pattern was familiar to anyone who'd spent time in military intelligence. Surveillance notes on suspected illegal operations. Tucked into the center of the notebook was a single photograph showing 3 men in civilian clothing standing beside a military transport plane. One face had been circled in red ink. A man Bill recognized with a shock that felt like ice water in his veins. Colonel James Harrington, his former commanding officer and, more significantly, the current head of Special Operations K-9 Training Division at Fort Campbell. The pieces began to align with disturbing clarity. Mercy hadn't died in a training accident. She'd witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see and had somehow escaped with evidence that could implicate powerful individuals. The training accident was a cover story to explain her disappearance, or more likely her elimination. Bill's thoughts were interrupted by Mercy's sudden alertness. Her ears perked forward, head tilted in a pose of intent listening. Unlike before, she didn't growl or show signs of alarm. Instead, her tail began to wag slowly, cautiously. Following her gaze to the window, Bill caught a glimpse of movement outside. Not the furtive approach of a threat, but the deliberate patrol pattern of multiple individuals moving with military precision through the trees surrounding his property. Flashlight beams cut through the rain in disciplined sweeps, gradually converging on the cabin. Bill's first instinct was to secure his position, but Mercy's reaction gave him pause. Military dogs were trained to distinguish between friendlies and hostiles. Her cautious optimism suggested these might be allies rather than enemies. Still, he wasn't taking chances. Bill positioned himself away from windows, shotgun ready, and waited as the approaching team reached his porch. A firm knock at the door was followed by a male voice that carried authority without aggression. "Mr. Callahan, this is Captain Michael Reynolds, U.S. and Army Special Forces. We're conducting a search and rescue operation in this area. We have reason to believe you may have encountered our subject." Bill remained silent, evaluating. The approach was professional, the terminology correct, but trust didn't come easily after what he'd discovered. "Mr. Callahan, if you're in there, we're aware of Mercy's situation. Her handler sent us. We're here to help, not harm." At the mention of her name, Mercy gave a soft bark, her first vocalization beyond whines and growls since Bill had found her. It wasn't an alarm bark, but something closer to recognition. Bill made his decision. "I'm armed," he called through the door. "Identify yourself properly." There was a pause, then, "Staff Sergeant William Callahan, 75th Ranger Regiment, later transferred to 5th Special Forces Group, 2 tours in Vietnam. Bronze Star, with Valor Device, Purple Heart. You served under Colonel Frank Miller in '71 during Operation Lamb Sun 719. That enough identification for you, Sergeant?" The details were correct. Information that would be available in his military record, but not commonly known. Still, Bill proceeded with caution. "Show yourself through the window, alone and unarmed." A moment later, a figure appeared at the window, a man in his 30s wearing tactical rain gear with no visible insignia. He held his empty hands up, palms forward. "We're not your enemy, Sergeant Callahan. Frank Miller was my father. He spoke highly of you." The mention of Frank Miller, his former commander who died 3 years after Vietnam from complications related to Agent Orange exposure, tilted the scales. Bill moved to the door, shotgun still in hand, but no longer aimed, and opened it a crack. The young man standing on his porch bore a striking resemblance to Frank. The same steady eyes and cleft chin. Behind him, Bill could make out 3 other figures maintaining a respectful distance, their tactical positioning suggesting professional training. "How did you find me?" Bill demanded. "We've been tracking Mercy for 6 days, Reynolds explained. "She's carrying a subdermal GPS tracker, standard for high-value military working dogs. The signal was weak, but when it stabilized at this location, we moved in." Bill considered this. And who exactly is we? Reynolds glanced over his shoulder at his team before answering. Officially, we don't exist. Unofficially, we're a specialized unit tasked with investigating corruption within military special operations programs. Mercy is a key witness in our case. A witness? Bill couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. She's a dog. Reynolds smiled slightly. A dog with a specialized camera mounted on her tactical vest, which she was wearing during her last official mission. A mission where she observed Colonel Harrington conducting unauthorized weapons sales to non-state actors. The pieces clicked into place. The notebook, Mercy's supposed death, the military-grade trap, it formed a coherent, if disturbing, picture. The vest is missing, Bill said. It wasn't on her when I found her, Reynolds nodded. We know. We believe she hid it somewhere after escaping. Dogs like Mercy are trained to secure evidence if their handlers are compromised. She would have hidden it someplace she considered safe. Bill thought of the puppies and their nest made partly from what looked like military rucksack material. I might know where to look, he said slowly. But first she needs medical attention. One of her puppies, too. At the mention of puppies, Reynolds' expression shifted to surprise. Puppies? There was no indication she was pregnant when she disappeared. Well, she has 4 of them now, Bill replied. And they're all half-starved and cold. Reynolds conferred briefly with his team before turning back to Bill. We have a medic with veterinary training. May we come in? You can keep your weapon if it makes you more comfortable. After a moment's hesitation, Bill stepped back, allowing the team entry. The cabin suddenly felt crowded with the addition of 4 tactical operators, their rain gear dripping onto Margaret's carefully maintained hardwood floors. The medic, a compact woman introduced only as Doc, immediately moved to examine Mercy and her puppies, her professional demeanor softening at the sight of the new mother. You did good work here, she told Bill, inspecting his field sutures. But she's going to need antibiotics and proper veterinary care. While Doc attended to Mercy, Reynolds explained their situation more fully. Harrington's weapons trafficking operation had been running for at least 3 years, using military transport flights and training exercises as cover. Mercy and her handler, Sergeant Jason Taylor, had stumbled upon one such transaction during what was supposed to be a routine training patrol. Taylor was killed in the so-called accident that allegedly claimed Mercy, Reynolds said grimly. But not before he activated her emergency protocols. She's been trained to evade and preserve evidence in case of handler loss. Smart animals, these military dogs, Bill commented, watching as Doc gently examined each puppy. But why not bring in regular military police or the FBI? Why the cloak and dagger routine? Reynolds' expression darkened. Because we don't know how high this goes. Harrington has connections throughout the chain of command. The last officer who raised questions about his operations was found dead in an apparent suicide 3 months ago. That explains the other search party, Bill said, describing the light he'd seen moving through the woods earlier. Reynolds nodded grimly. Harrington's men, almost certainly. They've been combing these mountains since Mercy's tracker briefly activated 6 days ago, which means we need to move quickly. He glanced at Doc, who was finishing her examination. What's the verdict? She's stable but needs proper care, Doc replied. The puppies are dehydrated but should recover with proper nutrition, except this little one. She held up the runt Bill had carried against his chest. He's the weakest. Touch and go. Reynolds made a decision. We need to move them to our safe location tonight. Mr. Callahan, you've done a tremendous service, but for your own safety, it's best if we handle things from here. Bill looked at Mercy, who watched the proceedings with alert intelligence, her puppies nestled securely against her. Something about the thought of them leaving created a hollow sensation in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Margaret's final days. I found something else, he said, retrieving the notebook from his jacket. It was with the puppies. Reynolds took the notebook with careful hands, his expression growing increasingly grave as he flipped through the pages. "This is Taylor's field journal. These are names, dates, locations of every illegal shipment Harrington has overseen." He looked up at Bill with newfound respect. "You may have just broken this case wide open." Before Bill could respond, one of the tactical team members by the window signaled urgently to Reynolds. "Movement in the tree line, east perimeter. Multiple hostiles approaching, armed." Reynolds's demeanor shifted instantly from grateful ally to combat commander. "How many?" "At least 6 that I can confirm, tactically positioned for an assault." Bill felt a familiar calm descend as adrenaline flooded his system. "This cabin has a root cellar. Access through the kitchen pantry. It's not on any property records." Reynolds nodded sharply. "Doc, get Mercy and the puppies down there. Johnson, secure our exit route through the back. Taylor set up a defensive position at the east window." He turned to Bill. "This isn't your fight, Mr. Callahan. You should take cover with the dogs." Bill retrieved his shotgun from where he'd propped it against the wall. The weight felt natural in his hands, the familiar heft of responsibility rather than a burden. "With all due respect, Captain, anyone who comes onto my property uninvited and armed has made it my fight." For a brief moment, Reynolds studied him, measuring the old soldier before him. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded once, sharply. "West window is yours then. Rules of engagement, defensive fire only, positive identification of hostile intent before shooting." As Doc carefully gathered Mercy and her puppies to move them to the cellar, the mother dog caught Bill's eye. In that moment of connection, he felt a wordless understanding pass between them. Two veterans prepared once more to stand their ground. Outside, the storm intensified as if responding to the growing tension, lightning illuminating the approaching figures as they used the weather for cover. Inside, Bill Callahan chambered a round in his shotgun and took up his position, prepared to defend his home and the unexpected family that had found their way to him on what had begun as his last day on Earth. The irony wasn't lost on him. This morning, he'd been ready to end everything. Now he was fighting with every fiber of his being to protect something that mattered. Through the rain-streaked window, he watched the shadowy figures advance, and for the first time in years, William Callahan felt fully, vibrantly alive. The first shot shattered the kitchen window, sending glass spraying across the worn linoleum floor. Bill instinctively ducked lower, pressing his shoulder against the solid oak frame of the western window. Across the room, Reynolds and his team had taken up defensive positions, their movements displaying the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to combat situations. "They're trying to draw fire to identify our positions," Reynolds said quietly into his radio. "Hold steady." Outside, the storm had reached its full fury, rain coming down in sheets so dense it was difficult to distinguish individual figures through the downpour. Lightning provided sporadic illumination, revealing glimpses of dark shapes moving with tactical precision toward the cabin. Bill counted at least 6 distinct figures, all carrying what appeared to be military-grade weapons, not the kind of hardware typically found in the hands of civilians. "Your friends bring the whole party?" Bill asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Reynolds shook his head grimly. "Harrington wouldn't risk coming himself. These are mercenaries, former military most likely, hired to clean up loose ends." He peered through a specialized scope attached to his rifle. "Wait for clear hostile intent. We need to be absolutely certain these aren't local law enforcement responding to the storm." Bill almost laughed at that. "Sheriff Wilson hasn't come up this ridge in 15 years, not since Margaret called about poachers, and he told her it wasn't worth the gas money." He adjusted his grip on the shotgun. "Besides, local law doesn't approach with fire teams in tactical formation." A voice boomed through the storm, artificially amplified by what sounded like a bullhorn. "Attention inside the cabin. This is a Department of Defense security team. We are conducting a retrieval operation for stolen military property. Exit the structure with your hands visible. Reynolds exchanged glances with his team. False credentials, he murmured. Standard Harrington playbook. They're trying to flush us out. From the root cellar beneath the kitchen, Bill could hear the faint sound of Mercy's growl, low and continuous, a warning rather than a threat. The sound anchored him somehow, connecting him to the reality of what they were protecting. Response, Bill asked, deferring to Reynolds's tactical command despite being on his own property. Reynolds considered for a moment. None. They know we're here. No point confirming exact positions. He checked his watch. If we can hold them off for another 40 minutes, our extraction team will be in position with air support. Another shot struck the cabin, this one splintering the wood beside the front door. Not a warning this time, a deliberate attempt to hit anyone who might be standing there. The intent was clear now. Defensive fire authorized, Reynolds said calmly into his radio. Precision shots only. Ammunition conservation is priority. Bill shifted his position slightly, bringing his shotgun to bear on the approach path from the western tree line. Through the rain, he could make out two figures advancing in a standard cover formation. Their movements were disciplined, professional. These weren't random thugs, but trained operators. That made them dangerous, but also predictable to someone who knew the playbook. When lightning flashed again, Bill took his shot. The shotgun roared in his hands, the familiar kick against his shoulder almost comforting in its familiarity. One of the advancing figures dropped immediately, while the second dove for cover. First blood had been drawn. Across the cabin, Reynolds and his team engaged with disciplined bursts of fire, each shot deliberate and targeted. No spray-and-pray tactics. These were professionals conserving ammunition while maximizing effectiveness. "Movement at your 3 o'clock, one of Reynolds's men called out to Bill, using the woodpile for cover. Bill swiveled smoothly, catching sight of a shadowy figure attempting to flank their position. His second shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him out from behind his cover and into the open, where one of Reynolds's team finished the job with clinical precision. The attackers responded with a coordinated barrage, bullets peppering the cabin from multiple angles. Bill hugged the floor as rounds punched through the thin wooden walls of his home, sending splinters flying. A framed photo of Margaret crashed to the floor beside him, glass shattering across the hardwood. "They're probing for weak points," Reynolds observed. "Standard breach preparation. They'll hit us with something bigger next." As if on cue, a new sound cut through the cacophony of gunfire and rain, the metallic clank of a grenade launcher being prepared. Bill recognized it instantly, memories of similar sounds in another jungle, another lifetime ago. "Down!" he shouted, already moving toward the kitchen and the root cellar entrance. "Incoming!" The explosion rocked the entire structure, blowing a massive hole in the eastern wall of the cabin. The concussive force knocked Bill off his feet, sending him sprawling across the kitchen floor. His ears rang painfully, the world momentarily reduced to a high-pitched whine and blurred vision. Through the smoke and debris, Bill could see that Reynolds' man, who had been positioned at the eastern window, was down, blood streaming from a head wound. Reynolds himself was already moving to drag his injured comrade to cover, firing one-handed as he did so. The breach had created an entry point, and the attackers weren't wasting the opportunity. Two figures appeared in the smoke-filled gap, weapons at the ready. Bill, still dazed from the explosion, struggled to bring his shotgun to bear. From beneath the floor came a sound that cut through Bill's disorientation, a deep, furious bark followed by scrabbling claws. Before anyone could react, the root cellar door burst open, and Mercy launched herself into the kitchen, teeth bared and hackles raised despite her injured leg. She moved with the fluid precision of a trained military dog, ignoring her wounds as she charged directly at the intruders. The first man barely had time to register the German Shepherd before she was on him, a 70-pound missile of fur and fury. Her teeth found his forearm with unerring accuracy, clamping down on the limb holding his weapon. The man screamed, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as Mercy dragged him to the ground. The second intruder swung his weapon toward the dog, but Bill had regained enough composure to act. His shotgun barked once more, the round catching the man in the chest and throwing him backward through the breach. Mercy released her first target, who was now clutching his mangled arm and howling in pain, and positioned herself in front of Bill, facing the breached wall. Her posture was unmistakable to anyone familiar with military working dogs. She was establishing a defensive perimeter, protecting what she considered her charge. "Good girl," Bill murmured, the simple praise feeling woefully inadequate for what she'd just done. Reynolds appeared at his side, face streaked with blood from a cut above his eye. "Your dog's got more fight in her than half the Special Forces guys I've known," he said, with grudging admiration. "But she shouldn't be up here. That leg won't hold much longer." As if to confirm his assessment, Mercy's injured hind leg trembled visibly, the strain of her exertion reopening the wound Bill had so carefully stitched. Yet she remained steadfast, her attention fixed on the breach and the threats beyond. "Doc," Reynolds called toward the cellar. "Status report." The medic's voice floated up from below. "Puppies are secure. I've got Johnson stabilized, but he needs evac ASAP. That grenade frag caught him good." Reynolds checked his watch again. 26 minutes to extraction. We need to hold this position." He surveyed the damaged cabin with a tactical eye. "We've lost the east side completely. Need to concentrate our defense to the west and north walls." Outside, the attackers had fallen back to regroup after their partial breach failed to secure the cabin. The momentary lull gave Bill time to assess their situation more thoroughly. The cabin he'd called home for 3 years was in ruins, the eastern wall demolished, windows shattered, furniture splintered by gunfire. The photograph of Margaret that had stood on the mantelpiece lay face down on the floor, its frame in pieces. Strange how little the destruction bothered him. After years of feeling tethered to this place by grief and memory, Bill now found himself concerned only with the living beings inside it. Reynolds's injured man, Mercy with her bleeding leg, the vulnerable puppies below. "We need to get Mercy back downstairs," Bill said, eyeing her trembling leg with concern. "She's reopened that wound." Reynolds nodded agreement, but before either man could move, Mercy's demeanor changed suddenly. Her ears flattened against her skull, a low growl building in her chest as she stared intently at the breached wall. Something had changed in the tactical situation outside. A new voice called through the gap, different from the bullhorn operator, closer, more conversational, and chillingly familiar to Bill. "Bill Callahan! Is that you in there, old friend? It's James Harrington. We served together in '71, remember? Da Nang Province." Bill and Reynolds exchanged glances. The situation had just escalated significantly. "Didn't expect to find you mixed up in this mess," Harrington continued when no response came. "Why don't you send out that dog and whatever she stole from me, and we can pretend this unfortunate incident never happened. A favor for an old war buddy." Bill's hand tightened on his shotgun. James Harrington had indeed been his commanding officer briefly during his second tour in Vietnam. A man he'd once respected until witnessing how carelessly he expended the lives of his men for personal glory. "He's trying to drive a wedge," Reynolds whispered. "Standard psychological tactic." "Don't engage." But Bill was already moving toward the breach, positioning himself where his voice would carry, but his body remained protected. "Not much of a favor when you've already blown half my house apart, James." Harrington's laugh floated through the rain. "Collateral damage, Bill. Wouldn't have happened if you hadn't harbored stolen government property. That dog belongs to Uncle Sam. To me, specifically." "Funny thing about that," Bill called back. Last I checked, the official record says Mercy died in a training accident. Hard for me to steal what's already dead." A pause followed. Then, "Always were too smart for your own good, Callahan. That's why you never made it past staff sergeant despite 3 recommendations for promotion. You ask too many questions." While this exchange continued, Reynolds was using the distraction to reposition his remaining men, silently directing them to new defensive locations with hand signals. The tactical situation was deteriorating. With the breach in the eastern wall, their defensive perimeter was compromised. "Here's what's going to happen." Harrington's voice hardened. "You're going to send out that dog and whatever documentation Taylor hid with her. In exchange, I'll let you and those puppies walk away. Reynolds and his little unauthorized task force, however, have some explaining to do back at headquarters." Reynolds stiffened at the mention of his name. "He knows exactly who we are," he muttered. "Someone up the chain is compromised." Mercy's growl deepened at the sound of Harrington's voice, her body language shifting from defensive to aggressive. Whatever history existed between Dog and Colonel, it clearly wasn't positive. "Clock's ticking, Callahan," Harrington called. "You got 3 minutes to make the right decision before my men come in and take what we want. And trust me, they won't be as gentle as they were on the first pass." Bill weighed their options rapidly. The cabin was compromised. Reynolds had an injured man needing evacuation. Mercy was bleeding again and in no condition for prolonged combat. The extraction team was still 20 minutes out, and now Harrington himself was on site, the architect of this entire situation and apparently willing to tie up loose ends personally. Making his decision, Bill turned to Reynolds. "Get your men, Mercy, and the puppies ready to move. I'm going to buy you some time." Reynolds frowned. "What are you planning?" "Something stupid," Bill admitted with a grim smile. "But I know these woods better than anyone, and I know James Harrington. He's arrogant enough to think he can predict my moves." Before Reynolds could object, Bill raised his voice again. "I'm coming out to talk, James. Just me, man to man like in the old days." Harrington's voice held a note of triumph. "Smart choice, Bill. Hands where we can see them." Bill set down his shotgun and moved toward the breached wall. Mercy whined in alarm, attempting to block his path despite her injury. "Stay," he commanded firmly, using the authoritative tone that military dogs were trained to obey. "Protect." With a final glance at Reynolds, who looked deeply skeptical but was already organizing his team for potential movement, Bill stepped carefully through the jagged opening in his cabin wall and into the rain-drenched night. The storm had slackened somewhat, the downpour reduced to a steady rainfall that soaked through Bill's clothing within seconds. In the clearing before his cabin stood James Harrington, older than Bill remembered but still carrying himself with the same arrogant assurance that had characterized his command style decades ago. Flanking him were 4 armed men in tactical gear, their weapons trained steadily on Bill. "There he is," Harrington said, as if greeting an old friend at a reunion. "The legendary Staff Sergeant Callahan, still playing the hero after all these years." Bill kept his hands visible, rain streaming down his face as he assessed the tactical situation. 4 visible hostiles plus Harrington, likely at least 2 more in overwatch positions in the tree line. His odds weren't good. "Not much heroic about living alone in the woods, James," Bill replied evenly. "Just a tired old man trying to find some peace." Harrington smiled without warmth. "Peace is overrated, Bill. Power, now that's worth pursuing." He gestured toward the ruined cabin. "Where's the dog and what she took from my operation? Let's keep this simple." Bill took a deliberate step forward, drawing attention to himself and away from the cabin. "Why don't you tell me what she saw that was worth killing her handler for? What's so important that you're willing to send a hit team after a dog?" Harrington's expression hardened. "That's classified information, Sergeant. You know the drill. Need-to-know basis only." "Seems to me," Bill continued, taking another step forward, that when you start killing American soldiers to cover up your side business, the usual rules don't apply anymore. A flash of genuine anger crossed Harrington's face. You have no idea what you're talking about, old man. The world's changed since our day. Sometimes maintaining American interests requires creative financing. Bill laughed, the sound harsh and deliberate. Is that what you call selling weapons to the highest bidder? Creative financing? He took another step forward, closing the distance inch by inch. The James Harrington I knew was ambitious and reckless with other people's lives, but I never took him for a traitor. The calculated insult hit its mark. Harrington's face flushed with rage. You self-righteous bastard! You think your sacrifice was any more meaningful than mine? You spent decades mopping up other people's wars while I built something that will last. He gestured to one of his men. Enough talk. Search the cabin. Find the dog and whatever evidence she has. Two of the armed men broke away, moving toward the breach in the cabin wall. Bill tensed, ready to act, when a sharp crack split the air. The distinctive sound of a high-caliber rifle fired from distance. One of Harrington's men dropped instantly, a precision shot having found its mark. For a split second, everyone froze in confusion. Then chaos erupted. "Sniper!" one of Harrington's remaining men shouted, diving for cover. Bill didn't hesitate. With the practiced motion of a man who'd spent years in combat zones, he launched himself directly at Harrington, closing the final distance between them in a desperate tackle. They went down together in the mud, Bill's momentum carrying them both clear of the immediate firefight. Harrington was younger and in better shape, but Bill had surprise and decades of close-quarters combat training on his side. They grappled in the mud, each fighting for control as gunfire erupted around them. Bill managed to pin one of Harrington's arms, landing a solid blow to his jaw that momentarily stunned the colonel. "Reynolds!" Bill shouted toward the cabin. "Go now! East extraction route!" From within the damaged structure came the sound of movement. Reynolds and his team making their escape with Mercy and the puppies, while Harrington's forces were distracted by the unexpected sniper and Bill's attack. Harrington recovered quickly, driving a knee into Bill's injured leg with precise cruelty. The pain was explosive, momentarily loosening Bill's grip enough for Harrington to reverse their positions. "You're throwing your life away for nothing," Harrington snarled, pinning Bill with surprising strength. "That dog is government property, and what she recorded is classified intelligence." Bill headbutted him with all the force he could muster, feeling Harrington's nose crunch beneath the impact. "She recorded you selling American weapons to terrorists," he spat. "And now everyone's going to know." Harrington recoiled, blood streaming from his broken nose. His hand moved to his belt, drawing a combat knife with practiced ease. "You always were a sanctimonious prick, Callahan. Too honorable for your own good." The knife descended toward Bill's chest with deadly intent, but a blur of motion intercepted it. 70 pounds of wet fur and focused fury as Mercy launched herself at Harrington, her teeth finding his wrist with surgical precision. The knife fell from suddenly nerveless fingers as the German shepherd, despite her injuries, executed her training to perfection. Harrington screamed, trying desperately to dislodge the dog clamped to his arm. Bill rolled clear, searching frantically for a weapon as the sounds of gunfire continued around them. Mercy maintained her grip, blood, both hers and Harrington's, mixing with rain and mud beneath them. One of Harrington's remaining men appeared through the downpour, weapon raised toward Mercy. Bill shouted a warning, but it was lost in the chaos of battle and storm. The man took aim at the dog, still locked onto his commander's arm. Before he could fire, another shot rang out from the distance, the mysterious sniper again finding their mark. The man crumpled without firing, his weapon falling uselessly into the mud. Mercy finally released Harrington's mangled arm, positioning herself between Bill and the colonel despite her visibly failing strength. Her injured leg could no longer bear weight, but she stood her ground, a guardian to the end. Harrington clutched his bleeding arm, his expression a mask of hatred as he looked from the dog to Bill. "This isn't over, Callahan. That evidence never reaches headquarters. I've got people throughout the chain of command." Bill climbed painfully to his feet, retrieving the fallen knife from the mud. "Looks pretty over from where I'm standing, James." A new sound cut through the diminishing gunfire, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching rapidly. Reynolds's extraction team had arrived, ahead of schedule or responding to the sound of combat. Harrington's eyes darted to the tree line, calculating his chances. With most of his team down and reinforcements arriving, the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. "We'll meet again," he promised, before turning and sprinting toward the cover of the forest. Bill started to pursue, but Mercy's whimpers stopped him. The German shepherd had finally succumbed to her injuries, collapsing onto her side in the mud. The sight of her, loyal to the end, fighting beyond her limits, made the choice simple. Harrington could wait. Mercy couldn't. Dropping to his knees beside her, Bill gathered the wounded dog carefully into his arms. "I've got you, girl," he murmured. "You did good. So damn good." Her amber eyes found his, filled with a trust that transcended species. The same trust he'd seen in the eyes of wounded comrades in another lifetime, when they'd looked to him for help, for hope, for simple human connection in their darkest moments. The helicopter appeared overhead, its searchlight cutting through the rain to illuminate the battlefield that had once been Bill Callahan's front yard. As medical personnel rappelled down to assist, Bill held Mercy close, shielding her from the rain with his body. "Stay with me," he urged her, feeling the weak thump of her tail against his leg. "That's an order, soldier." The military helicopter thundered overhead, its rotors battling the remnants of the storm as a tactical medical team descended on ropes. Bill held Mercy against his chest, her breathing shallow but persistent. Rain mingled with blood on her coat, washing away in pink rivulets that disappeared into the mud beneath them. "GSW to the right flank, severed arterial damage to the rear left leg, possible internal bleeding," the first medic rattled off as she knelt beside them, her practiced hands already moving across Mercy's body with professional efficiency. Bill reluctantly allowed them to take the dog from his arms, his hands suddenly empty and uncertain without her weight. "Her puppies," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the gunfire. "Reynolds evacuated with 4 puppies. The smallest one was in bad shape." The medic nodded without looking up from her work. "Captain Reynolds and his team are already aboard the primary transport with the puppies." "This is the extraction team." She glanced up, taking in Bill's blood-streaked face and the way he favored his left leg. "You're injured too, sir." Bill waved off her concern. "It's an old wound. Take care of Mercy." Around them, more personnel had descended, securing the perimeter and checking the downed attackers. Bill noticed they wore no insignia, their tactical gear deliberately anonymous. Whoever Reynolds worked for operated in the shadows of official channels. "Harrington escaped into the woods," Bill told the team leader, a compact man with the watchful eyes of a career operator. "Northwest bearing, about 3 minutes head start." The man spoke briefly into his radio, dispatching a pursuit team with a few crisp words. "Colonel Harrington is a secondary objective," he explained to Bill. "Securing the evidence and protecting the dog were primary." "And the puppies," Bill added, a statement rather than a question. The man's expression softened slightly. "Yes, sir." "The puppies, too." The medic had stabilized Mercy and was preparing her for transport, strapping her to a specialized stretcher designed for canine extraction. "We need to move now," she said urgently. "She's holding on, but that leg wound reopened completely during the fight. She's lost too much blood." Bill followed as they carried Mercy to the helicopter, his decades-old combat instincts allowing him to ignore the pain shooting through his knee with each step. The cabin, or what remained of it, stood in ruins behind him, smoke rising from the shattered eastern wall despite the rain. 30 years of his life reduced to splintered wood and broken glass in the space of 20 minutes. Strange how little that bothered him now. The helicopter interior was crowded but efficiently organized, with medical equipment secured along both walls and seating arranged to allow access to patients during flight. Reynolds was already aboard, his face tense as he monitored the treatment of his injured teammate. When he saw Bill, genuine relief flashed across his features. "Didn't think you'd make it," he admitted. "That was either the bravest or stupidest diversion I've ever seen." "Probably both," Bill acknowledged, finding a seat near where the medics were working on Mercy. "The puppies?" Reynolds gestured toward a secure carrier at the rear of the helicopter. "All 4 accounted for. Doc's got the little one on supplemental oxygen, but she thinks he'll pull through." The helicopter lifted off with a lurch that sent pain shooting through Bill's knee again. As they rose above the tree line, he caught a final glimpse of his property. The cabin where he'd planned to end his life that morning, now a smoking ruin, the surrounding clearing littered with the aftermath of battle. A chapter closed with fire rather than the quiet surrender he'd envisioned. "Mercy's not going to make it to base," the medic announced suddenly, her voice cutting through the engine noise with professional urgency. "That leg wound is worse than I initially assessed. She's hemorrhaging internally, and the field transfusion isn't keeping pace with blood loss." Bill felt the world narrow to a single point of focus, the wounded dog on the stretcher, her amber eyes finding his despite her pain. The same eyes that had looked up at him from the trap this morning, full of fear but also recognition, one soldier to another. "What are our options?" Reynolds demanded. The medic's expression was grave. "We're 20 minutes from our medical facility. She might have 5. "Denton Regional is closer," Bill said, remembering the map of local facilities he'd memorized during Margaret's illness. "They have a trauma center. 4 minutes if we divert now." "Denton is a civilian hospital," the team leader objected. "We can't compromise operational security by bringing a military working dog and combat casualties into a public facility." Bill reached out, placing his hand on Mercy's chest, where he could feel her heartbeat, too rapid, too faint. "She dies. Your evidence dies with her," he said simply. "Your choice." Reynolds and the team leader exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them before Reynolds nodded sharply. "Divert to Denton Regional, priority landing. I'll handle the paperwork and excuses." The pilot acknowledged, banking the helicopter into a steep turn that sent equipment sliding against its restraints. The medic continued working, her movements becoming more urgent as Mercy's condition deteriorated. "Stay with me, girl," Bill murmured, keeping his hand on her chest. "Just a few more minutes." Mercy's eyes remained fixed on his, trust evident despite the pain clouding them. Her tail thumped weakly against the stretcher, once, twice, before falling still. "Oh, she's crashing," the medic announced, reaching for the defibrillator. "I'm losing her pulse." Bill felt something break inside him, a dam that had held back emotion for so long it had become part of his anatomy. Not again. Not another loss. Not another companion who trusted him to bring them home safely. "Mercy," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that military dogs were trained to respond to. "Stay." The helicopter descended toward the illuminated helipad of Denton Regional Hospital, its emergency landing sending hospital staff scrambling. The moment they touched down, organized chaos erupted as the medics transferred Mercy to a gurney. Bill followed, ignoring the protests of both the military team and hospital security as he limped alongside the gurney, being rushed through automatic doors. "GSW to the right flank, femoral artery damage to the left hind leg, severe blood loss, pressure dropping," the military medic rattled off to the bewildered trauma team that met them. "This is a dog," one doctor stated the obvious, clearly confused by the military presence and the urgency surrounding a canine patient. "This is a multi-decorated military working dog with critical evidence," Reynolds interjected, flashing credentials that made the doctor's eyebrows rise. "And right now, she's the most important patient in your hospital." To their credit, the trauma team adapted quickly. A young resident stepped forward. "I worked with the K-9 unit in Chicago before medical school. I know K-9 trauma. Get her to OR 3. As they wheeled Mercy toward the operating room, her condition continuing to deteriorate, Bill found himself stopped by a nurse with kind but firm eyes. "Sir, you can't go into the OR. You need treatment yourself." Bill looked down, realizing for the first time that he was covered in blood. Some his, some Mercy's, some belonging to James Harrington. His knee had swollen to twice its normal size, and a graze along his temple had left half his face masked in crimson. "I need to be with her," he insisted, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. How many times had he said the same about Margaret during her final days? The nurse's expression softened. "The best thing you can do for her is let us treat you so you're there when she wakes up. She's going to need you then." The simple logic penetrated Bill's adrenaline-fueled determination. He allowed himself to be led to an examination room, though his eyes remained fixed on the OR doors that had swallowed Mercy until they disappeared from view. The next hours passed in a blur of medical procedures, bureaucratic complications, and increasingly creative explanations from Reynolds to the hospital administration. Yet Bill submitted to treatment with stoic detachment, stitches for the graze on his temple, a brace for his re-injured knee, antibiotics for the various cuts and abrasions acquired during the fight. Throughout it all, one question burned in his mind, one he didn't dare ask until Reynolds appeared in the doorway of his treatment room, his expression unreadable. "Mercy?" Bill asked, the single word containing all his fear. Reynolds's face remained neutral. "She's still in surgery. It's been 3 hours. They've replaced her entire blood volume twice." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The veterinary surgeon they called in says it doesn't look good, but she's still fighting." Bill nodded, unsurprised. "She's a soldier. Fighting is what we do." "The puppies are stable," Reynolds continued. "Even the runt is showing improvement. We've set up a temporary secure area in the hospital's administrative wing. My team is handling security and cleanup at your property." He hesitated before adding, "I'm sorry about your cabin." Bill considered this, the home he'd shared with Margaret, the place where he'd planned to die, now destroyed. Strange how the loss felt almost like relief, as if a burden had been lifted rather than imposed. "Just wood and nails," he said finally. It served its purpose. Reynolds seemed about to respond when his radio crackled to life. He listened intently, his expression shifting from neutral to concerned. "Understood. Secure the perimeter. No one in or out without Level 3 clearance." He turned to Bill, professional mask back in place. "We need to move you. Now." "What's happened?" "Harrington's people traced us to the hospital. We've got potential hostiles in the vicinity." Reynolds was already in motion, summoning a wheelchair despite Bill's protests. "We've established a secure floor for Mercy's recovery. You'll be safer there, too." As they navigated the hospital corridors, Reynolds filled him in on the developing situation. Harrington had escaped their pursuit team but was now a wanted man. The evidence from Mercy's nest, particularly the notebook, contained enough information to launch a full investigation into his weapons trafficking operation. However, with his connections throughout the military hierarchy, Harrington remained dangerous, perhaps even more so as a cornered animal. "We think he's making one last attempt to eliminate the evidence and witnesses before going underground," Reynolds explained as they entered a service elevator requiring keycard access. "Which means both you and Mercy are still targets." The elevator opened onto a hospital floor that had been transformed into a military-grade secure area in remarkably short time. Armed personnel stood at regular intervals along the corridor, and equipment that certainly didn't belong to the hospital had been installed at strategic points. "The puppies are here," Reynolds said, leading Bill to a room that had been converted into a makeshift nursery. Inside, the 4 German Shepherd puppies were settled in a specially constructed pen with heating elements and monitoring equipment. A military veterinarian was checking the smallest one, who lay slightly apart from his siblings. "How's the runt doing?" Bill asked, wheeling himself closer to the pen. The vet glanced up. "Touch and go for a while, but he's stabilized now. These military working dog bloodlines are resilient." She studied Bill with professional interest. "You're the one who found them?" Bill nodded, reaching out to let the more active puppies sniff his fingers. They responded with enthusiasm, tiny tails wagging as they attempted to climb over each other to reach him. "They recognize your scent," the vet observed. "You've imprinted on them already." Something about her comment struck Bill deeply. The idea that in the span of a single day, these creatures had formed a bond with him strong enough to remember his scent, to associate it with safety. It seemed impossible, yet there they were, squirming with excitement at his presence. "Mercy's out of surgery," Reynolds announced from the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. The surgical team did everything they could. Bill felt his heart constrict. The careful phrasing, the neutral tone, he recognized the approach used to deliver bad news. He'd used it himself, standing at too many doors with folded flags. "Take me to her," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Reynolds wheeled him to a room at the end of the corridor, converted into a specialized recovery space for a canine patient. Medical equipment crowded around a padded table where Mercy lay motionless, tubes and wires connecting her to various monitors. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, mechanical regularity, breathing, but only with assistance. The veterinary surgeon, still in scrubs stained with blood, looked up as they entered. "Mr. Callahan, I'm Dr. Winters. I operated on Mercy." Her expression was grave, but not without compassion. "We repaired the arterial damage and removed the bullet fragments, but she suffered significant trauma. The blood loss alone would have killed most dogs. We've induced a medical coma to give her body a chance to recover, but—" She hesitated. "Just give it to me straight, Doc," Bill said quietly. "I've heard bad news before." Dr. Winters nodded, respecting his directness. "The next 12 hours are critical. Even if she survives, the damage to her leg was extensive. She'll never return to active duty. She may not walk normally again." She paused, studying Bill's face. "I understand she's a military asset, and those decisions aren't typically made with sentiment in mind." Bill understood the unspoken question. Military working dogs with career-ending injuries were sometimes euthanized if they couldn't be rehabilitated or adopted. A cold calculus of resource allocation that had always troubled him. "She's not just an asset," Reynolds interjected before Bill could respond. "She's a witness and a hero. Whatever it takes to save her, do it." Dr. Winters seemed satisfied with this answer. "We're doing everything medically possible. The rest is up to her." She glanced at the monitors. "She's fighting hard. That's a good sign." When the doctor left, Bill wheeled himself to Mercy's side. Her normally alert face was slack in unconsciousness, tubes running into her muzzle and veins. Bandages covered much of her body, starkest where her injured leg had been operated on. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than the fierce protector who had launched herself at armed men mere hours ago. "I've arranged for you to stay in this room," Reynolds said quietly. "My team will maintain security. The puppies will be brought in once Mercy is stable enough." Bill nodded his thanks, unable to find words as he gently laid his hand on Mercy's head between her ears. Her fur was still the same soft texture it had been this morning when he'd found her in the trap. A lifetime ago, it seemed. Reynolds hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, I've seen a lot of soldiers in my time, human and canine. She's one of the best." He left without waiting for a response, closing the door quietly behind him. Alone with Mercy, Bill finally allowed the events of the day to settle over him. This morning he had risen with the intention of ending his life, convinced that nothing remained worth continuing for. Now he sat vigil beside a wounded dog who had quite literally dragged him back from that brink, who had trusted him, fought alongside him, saved him in more ways than one. "I had a dog like you once," he told her quietly, his hand resting gently on her head. "In Vietnam, Ajax. Best tracking dog in the unit." The memories surfaced with surprising clarity. Not the painfully sharp edges they usually carried, but softer somehow, mellowed by time and perspective. "He saved my life 3 times before I failed to save his." The monitors beeped steadily, marking Mercy's continued fight. Outside the window, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a night sky beginning to show the first hints of dawn. "I'm not going to fail you," Bill promised, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got puppies to raise. A lot of living left to do." He paused, feeling the weight of his next words. "And so do I, it seems." As the first light of morning painted the horizon in shades of promise, Bill Callahan maintained his vigil, his hand resting protectively on Mercy's head. The dog who had arrived in his life on what was to be his last day had instead given him something he'd lost long ago, a reason to see the next sunrise, and the one after that. The road ahead would be difficult for both of them. Recovery, rehabilitation, the continued threat from Harrington and his allies. But for the first time in years, Bill found himself looking forward rather than back, planning for tomorrows instead of dwelling on yesterdays. As if sensing his thoughts, one of the monitors attached to Mercy registered a slight change, a marginally stronger heartbeat, a fractional improvement in oxygen levels. Dr. Winters had said the next 12 hours were critical. Hour 1 showed the first fragile sign of hope. "That's it, girl," Bill encouraged softly. "One step at a time. We'll get through this together." Outside the secured room, Reynolds and his team maintained their vigilant guard. The puppies slept peacefully in their temporary nursery. And somewhere in the growing light of dawn, a wounded dog and a wounded man began the long journey of healing, not just surviving, but finding their way back to living. Dawn had fully broken by the time Bill felt himself drifting into an exhausted sleep, his hand still resting on Mercy's head. The uncomfortable hospital chair had become his post, one he refused to abandon despite Reynolds's repeated suggestions that he rest in a proper bed. The military team had established a perimeter around the entire hospital floor, their presence explained to the civilian staff as a matter of national security. Not entirely untrue, Bill reflected. He was awakened by a gentle touch on his shoulder. Dr. Winters stood beside him, her expression cautiously optimistic as she checked Mercy's vital signs. "Her numbers are improving," she said quietly. "Blood pressure stabilizing, oxygen levels up. She's fighting hard." Bill straightened, wincing at the stiffness in his back and the persistent throb in his knee. "When will you bring her out of the coma?" "If she continues improving at this rate, we'll start reducing the sedation this afternoon, Doctor." Winters examined the surgical site on Mercy's hind leg with professional detachment. "The repair to the femoral artery is holding. No signs of infection yet, but that's still a concern with a field injury." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Reynolds entered, accompanied by a woman Bill didn't recognize. Tall, with silver-streaked dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The insignia on her uniform identified her as a full colonel. "Mr. Callahan," Reynolds began formally, "this is Colonel Patricia Winters, Director of Special Investigations, Army Criminal Investigation Division." Bill made to stand, military habit ingrained despite decades of civilian life, but Colonel Winters waved him back to his seat. "Please, don't get up on my account, especially not with that knee." Her voice carried the slight drawl of a Virginia upbringing, softening the crisp authority of her manner. "I understand we owe you a significant debt." Bill shrugged uncomfortably. "I just helped a wounded dog. Anyone would have done the same. Facing down a corrupt colonel and his mercenary team while protecting classified evidence?" Winters raised an eyebrow. "I think we both know that's not standard civilian behavior." She moved closer to examine Mercy, her expression softening. "I knew her handler, Sergeant Taylor. Good man. Thorough, meticulous, exactly the kind of soldier you want investigating suspicious activity." The mention of Mercy's original handler hung in the air. Bill hesitated before asking, what happened to him? The real story, not the official one. Colonel Winters and Reynolds exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them before she nodded. Jason Taylor was conducting routine security sweeps at Fort Campbell when he and Mercy encountered an unscheduled night delivery at the airfield. Standard procedure would be to record and report, which he did. What he didn't know was that the delivery was part of Harrington's operation, weapons being diverted from military inventory to private buyers. She moved to the window, looking out at the morning sun illuminating the hospital parking lot. 2 days later, Taylor was found dead in what was staged to look like a training accident. Mercy disappeared, presumed dead as well. What Harrington didn't account for was that Taylor had activated Mercy's specialized training protocol, essentially instructing her to preserve evidence and evade capture if something happened to him. "She's been running and hiding for 2 years?" Bill asked incredulously, looking at the wounded dog with new respect. "Not exactly," Reynolds interjected. "We believe she was captured shortly after Taylor's death and held at one of Harrington's private facilities for specialized military dog training. The evidence suggests she escaped during transport about 3 months ago, likely already pregnant from breeding attempts." The thought of what Mercy had endured, captivity, forced breeding, escape while pregnant, giving birth in the wild, and still managing to preserve the evidence entrusted to her, was staggering. Bill gently stroked her head, marveling at the resilience contained within this single creature. "The notebook you recovered contains detailed records of at least 17 illegal weapons transfers," Colonel Winters continued. "Coupled with the evidence from Mercy's tactical vest, which Reynolds' team recovered from the drainage system after evacuating the puppies, we have enough to bring down not just Harrington, but his entire network." "Have you caught him yet?" Bill asked, the memory of Harrington's escape still fresh. The colonel's expression tightened. "Not yet. He's gone to ground, but we have assets deployed nationwide." "It's only a matter of time." She hesitated before adding, "which brings me to a difficult matter. As long as Harrington remains at large, both you and Mercy remain targets." Bill understood immediately. "You want to move us to a secure location." "It would be the prudent course of action," she confirmed. "We've prepared a safe house specifically designed for witnesses in high-risk situations. You and Mercy would have round-the-clock protection until Harrington is apprehended and the case against his network is fully prosecuted." Bill glanced around the hospital room that had become their temporary sanctuary. "And the puppies?" "They would come too, of course," Reynolds assured him. "We wouldn't separate them." The offer made practical sense. Bill had no home to return to. The cabin was destroyed, and he had no family expecting him. Margaret was gone. Thomas rarely called, and only Sarah maintained regular contact. There was nothing tying him to his former life except memories, many of which he'd been ready to escape permanently just yesterday. "How long?" he asked. Colonel Winters didn't sugarcoat her answer. "Potentially months. These investigations move slowly by necessity. We need to ensure we capture everyone involved, not just Harrington." Before Bill could respond, a subtle change in the room's atmosphere drew his attention back to Mercy. Her breathing had shifted, becoming less mechanical and more natural. One of the monitors showed an increase in brain activity. Dr. Winters immediately moved to check her patient, professionally efficient, as she assessed the readings. "She's beginning to emerge from the coma on her own," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "That's much sooner than I expected. Her resilience is remarkable." As they watched, Mercy's eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway. Her amber gaze was unfocused at first, clouded by medication and trauma. Then, with visible effort, she turned her head slightly toward Bill, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Hey there, soldier," Bill said softly, his throat suddenly tight. "Welcome back." Mercy's tail thumped weakly against the examination table, once, twice, 3 times, before she exhaled deeply and closed her eyes again, this time in natural sleep, rather than medicated unconsciousness. Dr. Winters checked the monitors again, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction. "She's past the critical point. Barring complications, she should recover, though rehabilitation for that leg will be extensive." A weight Bill hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from his chest. He'd lost so many companions over the years, human and canine alike. The possibility of adding Mercy to that list had been more devastating than he'd allowed himself to recognize. Colonel Winters observed this interaction with thoughtful eyes. "Mr. Callahan, there's another option we should discuss." She nodded to Reynolds, who produced a folder from his briefcase and handed it to her. "Given your military background, your demonstrated ability to handle high-stress situations, and your obvious bond with Mercy, we'd like to offer you a position." Bill accepted the folder warily. "I'm a bit old for re-enlistment, Colonel." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Not military service. We're proposing you join our Witness Protection and Rehabilitation Program as Mercy's official handler and rehabilitator." She gestured to the folder. "The program provides specialized housing on secure military property, medical care for both you and Mercy, and a stipend commensurate with your military rank and experience." Bill opened the folder, scanning the documents within. The proposal was detailed and generous. A purpose-built cabin on a remote corner of Fort Campbell with facilities specifically designed for canine rehabilitation, comprehensive medical care that would address his own knee issues as well as Mercy's recovery, and financial compensation that exceeded his modest military pension. "This isn't standard procedure," he observed, looking up at Winters with skeptical eyes. "No, it isn't," she acknowledged frankly. "But neither is a retired staff sergeant single-handedly helping to break open one of the largest weapons trafficking cases in recent military history." She paused, her tone softening slightly. "Mercy needs someone she trusts for her rehabilitation. Military working dogs with her level of training and experience are invaluable assets, Mr. Callahan. Even if she never returns to active duty, her genetics and training make her and her puppies extremely important to our program." Reynolds cleared his throat. "What the Colonel is diplomatically avoiding saying is that Mercy has bonded with you in a way that's rare even among handler relationships. She protected you, fought for you. That kind of trust can't be manufactured or replaced." Bill looked back at Mercy, sleeping peacefully now with the first natural rest she'd had in perhaps months. The puppies would be brought in soon to nurse now that she was stable. A family reunion that yesterday morning would have seemed impossible when his only plan had been a final letter and a quiet ending. "What about Harrington?" he asked. "Won't a military facility be the first place he looks?" Colonel Winters's expression hardened. "Harrington no longer has access to military installations or information. His clearances were revoked the moment Reynolds's team confirmed the evidence against him. Furthermore, the location we're proposing is known to fewer than 10 people in the entire Department of Defense. Your safety and Mercy's is our highest priority." The offer represented something Bill hadn't considered, a future, not just survival but purpose, responsibility, connection. The very things that had seemed irretrievably lost after Margaret's death. A soft whine from Mercy drew his attention. Her eyes had opened again, more alert this time, seeking confirmation that he was still there. Bill placed his hand gently on her head, and she relaxed visibly at his touch. "When can the puppies come in?" he asked Dr. Winters. "She needs to see that they're safe." The veterinarian nodded. "I'll have them brought in now. The contact will be good for all of them." As Dr. Winters left to arrange the reunion, Colonel Winters stepped closer to Bill's chair. "You don't have to decide immediately. Take some time to consider the offer." Bill looked up at her, seeing beyond the uniform to the person beneath, someone who understood duty, purpose, and the complicated bonds formed in service. "What happens to Mercy and the puppies if I decline?" The colonel didn't flinch from the direct question. Mercy would be retired from service and placed with an experienced handler familiar with combat-traumatized dogs. The puppies would enter our training program when they reach the appropriate age. They would be well cared for, Mr. Callahan. I give you my word on that. "But separated," Bill concluded. "Most likely, yes. The puppies would be assigned to different divisions based on their aptitudes." Bill nodded, unsurprised. The military operated on practicality, not sentiment. It always had. The door opened as orderlies brought in the puppy carrier, carefully supervised by the military veterinarian. The 4 puppies were alert and active, their tiny bodies wiggling with excitement as they caught their mother's scent. "Easy now," the vet cautioned as the orderlies prepared to transfer the puppies to Mercy's side. "She's still recovering from major surgery. Keep them on her good side." Bill watched as each puppy was carefully placed beside Mercy on the padded examination table. Her reaction was immediate and profound. Her tail thumped with renewed vigor, and she made a visible effort to shift positions so she could nuzzle each puppy in turn, checking them with the thoroughness of a mother who had feared losing her children. The smallest puppy, still noticeably weaker than its siblings, received the most attention. Mercy carefully cleaned its face and ears, encouraging it with gentle nudges until it found a nipple and began to nurse. The other 3 quickly followed suit, arranging themselves along their mother's belly with the instinctive efficiency of newborns. The scene struck Bill with unexpected force, the completeness of it, the rightness. A family reunited against considerable odds, finding their way back to each other through darkness and danger. It reminded him of something Margaret had said during her final weeks, when the pain had been at its worst and he'd been drowning in anticipated grief. "Life finds a way to continue, Bill," she had told him, her hand frail but warm in his. "Not always the way we expect or plan, but it finds a way. Your job is to be open to it when it does." He hadn't understood then, couldn't imagine any life continuing meaningfully after losing her, but watching Mercy with her puppies, this unexpected family that had literally appeared on his doorstep on what was to be his last day, he finally began to grasp what Margaret had meant. Colonel Winters and Reynolds had withdrawn to the corner of the room, giving Bill space to witness the reunion without intrusion. He appreciated their discretion, the recognition that something profound was occurring beyond the tactical and strategic implications of their mission. After several minutes of watching the peaceful nursing, Bill looked up at them. "I'll need some modifications to the offer," he said. Colonel Winters raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "The puppies stay together, at least until they're fully weaned and socialized. Mercy decides when that happens, not a training schedule." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "And I want a hand in their training. No separation until they're ready, and no combat deployments unless absolutely necessary." Reynolds looked surprised at the conditions, but Colonel Winters merely nodded thoughtfully. "Military working dog protocols typically call for early specialized training." "I'm familiar with the protocols," Bill interrupted. "I helped write some of them back in '75. They're good protocols for most situations, but this isn't most situations." He gestured to the family before them. "These dogs have been through hell already. They deserve some stability before we ask more of them." The colonel studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Bill's surprise, she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her authoritative demeanor. "Margaret always said you were stubborn when it came to doing right by your dogs." Bill stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You knew Margaret?" "Women in the military command structure weren't common in our day," she explained. "We met at a support group for military spouses during your second deployment. Lost touch over the years, reconnected when I was stationed at Fort Campbell while she was receiving treatment there." Her expression softened with memory. "She was incredibly proud of you, you know. Worried, too, especially this past year." The revelation that Colonel Winters had known Margaret, had perhaps been entrusted with knowledge of his struggles after her death, shifted Bill's perception of the entire situation. Was this offer of purpose mere coincidence, or something Margaret had set in motion before her passing, knowing what he would need when she was gone? "Your conditions are acceptable," Colonel Winters said, returning to her professional demeanor. "I'll have the agreement modified accordingly." She extended her hand to Bill. "Do we have a deal, Sergeant Callahan?" Bill looked at Mercy and her puppies, then back at the colonel's outstretched hand. The choice before him was clear: continue the solitary path toward oblivion he'd been following, or embrace this unexpected second chance at purpose and connection. He took her hand, his grip firm and decisive. "We have a deal, Colonel." As they shook hands, sealing the agreement that would chart a new course for all their lives, the smallest puppy lifted its head from nursing and regarded Bill with curious eyes that somehow already held the intelligent awareness characteristic of its mother. Its tiny tail wagged once as if approving the decision that would keep their newfound family together. Outside the hospital window, the sky had cleared completely. The storm of the previous night washed away to reveal a world renewed. Somewhere in that world, James Harrington remained at large, a threat not yet neutralized. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Bill Callahan looked toward the future with something resembling hope, not just for survival, but for healing, for purpose, for connection. Margaret had been right, as she so often was. Life had found a way to continue, appearing in the most unexpected form on what should have been his last day on earth. A wounded German shepherd and her vulnerable puppies had accomplished what grief counselors, medication, and well-meaning family members could not. They had given him a reason to see tomorrow and the day after and all the days that would follow. For a man who had been ready to end everything, it was nothing short of a resurrection. 6 months later, the autumn leaves painted the hills surrounding Fort Campbell in brilliant hues of red and gold. Bill stood on the porch of his new cabin, coffee mug in hand, watching as Mercy navigated the specially designed rehabilitation course in the yard. Her movement was still marked by a pronounced limp, the surgically repaired leg never quite regaining its full strength, but she approached each obstacle with determined focus. "Looking good, girl," he called encouragingly as she completed the final platform jump, modified to accommodate her limitations. "Personal best time today," Mercy responded with a joyful bark, her tail wagging with satisfaction as she trotted back to Bill's side. At 10 months old, her puppies raced around her, their adolescent energy a stark contrast to their mother's measured movements. They had grown into handsome young dogs, their German Shepherd lineage evident in their powerful builds and intelligent expressions. The puppies had thrived under the combined care of Bill and the military veterinary team, growing from helpless infants to energetic adolescents with distinctive personalities. Bill had named them in consultation with Mercy, who seemed to approve or disapprove of his suggestions through subtle changes in ear position and tail movement. The largest male became Ajax, after Bill's Vietnam partner. The female with the distinctive white chest marking was Margaret, a tribute that had felt right the moment he suggested it. The playful male with the perpetually tilted head became Scout, for his curious nature, and the smallest one, the runt who had fought so hard to survive, was Taylor, honoring Mercy's original handler who had died protecting her. Each day brought new developments in their training and in the case against Harrington's network. Reynolds visited weekly with updates on the investigation, which had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. The evidence Mercy had preserved implicated not just Harrington but 3 generals, a defense contractor CEO, and numerous lower-ranking accomplices in a weapons trafficking operation spanning 5 countries. Harrington himself remained at large, a fact that cast the only shadow over Bill's new life. Security protocols remained stringent, with daily perimeter checks and constant electronic surveillance of the property. Bill was permitted to leave only for medical appointments, and even those were conducted with armed escorts. The isolation might have bothered some, but after years of self-imposed solitude in the Ozarks, Bill found the arrangement comfortable. The puppies had finished their morning exercise and now lounged in various spots around the porch, their tongues lolling as they recovered their breath. Only Taylor remained active, persistently bringing a training dummy to Bill with hopeful eyes. "You never quit, do you?" Bill chuckled, taking the dummy and tossing it a modest distance for the smallest dog. Despite his size, Taylor had developed into the most focused and determined of the litter, qualities that reminded Bill of both Mercy and the handler she had lost. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Bill tensed instinctively, a habit from decades of military service reinforced by the ongoing threat from Harrington. Mercy was immediately alert, moving to Bill's side in a protective stance. The puppies, sensing the shift in mood, ceased their playful behavior and arranged themselves in a loose formation behind their mother. Bill relaxed when he recognized Reynolds's government-issued SUV approaching the cabin. The captain visited regularly enough that his arrival shouldn't trigger alarm, but something about the vehicle's speed suggested urgency. "Stay," Bill instructed the dogs, moving to the edge of the porch as Reynolds parked and emerged from the vehicle. The captain's expression was tightly controlled, the face of a man delivering significant news but trying to manage his own reaction to it. "Morning, Bill," Reynolds called, approaching the steps. He acknowledged the dogs with a practiced hand signal that Mercy recognized as friendly. "Got a minute to talk?" "Coffee's fresh," Bill replied, gesturing toward the cabin door. Whatever news Reynolds brought, it warranted privacy. Inside, Bill poured 2 mugs while Reynolds arranged files on the kitchen table. The cabin's interior reflected Bill's preference for simplicity, with the notable additions of Margaret's bird figurines, recovered from the ruins of his old home, and new photographs of Mercy and the puppies at various stages of growth. "What's happened?" Bill asked, setting the coffee down and lowering himself into a chair opposite Reynolds. Reynolds took a deliberate sip before answering. "We found Harrington." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with implications. Bill studied Reynolds's expression, searching for clues to elaborate on those 3 words. "Alive?" "No." Reynolds opened one of the files, turning it so Bill could see the photographs within. Commercial fishing vessel pulled up his body in the Gulf of Mexico yesterday morning. Mexican waters, about 40 miles south of Galveston. He'd been in the water approximately 2 weeks, according to preliminary forensics. Bill examined the photographs with clinical detachment, the bloated features barely recognizable, the distinctive scar on Harrington's left forearm, one of the few identifiable markers. "Suicide?" Reynolds shook his head. "Execution style. Single gunshot to the back of the head, hands bound with wire. Professional job." He closed the file, his expression grim. "This complicates things. His own people turned on him," Bill concluded. "It wasn't a question. That's our working theory. As we closed in on the network, Harrington became a liability. Someone higher up decided to eliminate the risk. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, fatigue evident in the lines around his eyes. The problem is we still don't know who gave that order, which means the threat remains, Bill finished. Maybe even increases. Reynolds nodded. Colonel Winters has ordered enhanced security for all witnesses and evidence in the case. You'll be seeing some new faces around the perimeter, additional patrols. Bill absorbed this information, considering its implications for their daily routine. What about the puppies' training assessment next month? Still happening? Postponed indefinitely. Reynolds reached for another file. Which brings me to the second reason for my visit. The Colonel has a proposal. The file contained architectural plans for what appeared to be an expanded version of Bill's current facility, additional kennels, a larger training area, and a second residential structure adjacent to the main cabin. "What am I looking at?" Bill asked, though he had already begun to suspect. "The investigation and trials will likely continue for years," Reynolds explained. "We need a secure location to house and train canine witnesses and evidence, somewhere off the standard military grid but still under our protection." He gestured to the plans. "Colonel Winters believes this location is ideal, and your background makes you the perfect person to oversee the operation." Bill studied the proposal with increasing interest. "You're talking about a safe house for dogs," Reynolds smiled slightly. "That's one way to put it." "Officially, it would be designated as a specialized canine training and rehabilitation facility. Unofficially, yes, a witness protection program for military working dogs and their handlers involved in sensitive cases." The concept was unexpectedly appealing. Bill had found genuine satisfaction in working with Mercy and her puppies, rediscovering skills and purpose he'd thought lost to time and grief. The idea of expanding that work to help other dogs, and by extension, other handlers, stirred something in him that had been dormant for too long. "Who would help run it?" he asked, already considering logistical challenges. "That's part of the proposal." Reynolds hesitated before continuing. "Your son Thomas was recently approached about a civilian contractor position with our division. His corporate security background makes him well qualified and—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He expressed interest in relocating closer to you after learning about your involvement with the Harrington case." Bill felt a jolt of surprise. Thomas had visited only twice since Bill moved to Fort Campbell. Brief, somewhat awkward encounters that had nevertheless represented more contact than they'd had in the previous 3 years combined. The idea that his son might consider working alongside him seemed almost unbelievable. "Thomas said that?" Bill couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Reynolds reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope. "He asked me to give you this. Said it might explain things better than he could in person." Bill accepted the envelope, recognizing Thomas's precise handwriting, addressing it simply to Dad. The weight of it suggested multiple pages, more written communication than his son had offered in years. "There's more," Reynolds continued, allowing Bill time to process this unexpected development. "Your granddaughter Sarah has applied for an internship with our veterinary division. Her application cited her experiences with Mercy and the puppies during her visits here as her primary motivation." The convergence of these developments, Harrington's death, the facility expansion proposal, Thomas's potential involvement, Sarah's application, felt almost orchestrated in its timing. Bill had lived long enough to be wary of coincidences, particularly when they aligned so neatly with both his needs and the military's objectives. "Colonel Winters has been planning this for a while," he observed, setting Thomas's unopened letter aside for later, private consideration. Reynolds didn't deny it. "The Colonel recognizes talent and opportunity. The Harrington case demonstrated a critical vulnerability in how we handle canine witnesses and evidence. This facility would address that gap while providing you with meaningful work and a chance to reconnect with your family. He shrugged slightly. Multiple objectives achieved with a single solution. It's efficient. Bill couldn't help but smile at the typically military justification for what was, at its core, a deeply personal proposition. Colonel Winters, Margaret's friend, he reminded himself, was offering him not just continued purpose, but a chance to rebuild the family connections that had frayed since Margaret's death. From the yard came the sound of Mercy's bark, not alarmed, but alerting. Bill moved to the window to see a military transport vehicle approaching the gate. When it stopped, the rear doors opened to reveal Dr. Winters, the veterinarian who had saved Mercy's life, accompanied by another German shepherd on a leash. This dog moved with the same wary alertness that had characterized Mercy when Bill first found her, its posture suggesting both training and trauma. "Right on schedule," Reynolds commented, joining Bill at the window. "That's Rex, former explosives detection K9 from Afghanistan. Witnessed his handler's murder during an investigation into missing weapons. Sound familiar?" Bill watched as the new dog surveyed its surroundings, clearly tense but responding to Dr. Winters's gentle guidance. "You already started the program." "Pilot case," Reynolds confirmed. "Colonel Winters thought you might appreciate meeting Rex before making your decision about the facility expansion." He hesitated before adding, "His handler was a friend of Taylor's, Mercy's original handler. There's a connection there, though neither dog knows it." The symmetry was striking. Bill observed as Dr. Winters led Rex toward the training area where Mercy and her puppies had gathered, curious about the newcomer. Mercy's posture changed subtly as she caught Rex's scent, recognition not of the individual, but of the experience they shared. Fellow soldiers who had seen combat, lost companions, carried evidence of crimes others had tried to bury. "I need to be out there for that introduction," Bill said, already moving toward the door. Reynolds followed, the facility plans temporarily forgotten in the more immediate need to manage the meeting between two potentially traumatized military dogs. Outside, Bill approached Dr. Winters with measured steps, signaling Mercy to hold her position with the puppies. "Morning, Doc. I see you brought a visitor." Dr. Winters smiled in greeting. "Staff Sergeant Callahan, meet Sergeant Rex, formerly of the 48th Military Police Detachment. He's had a rough few months and needs somewhere quiet to recover while his handler's case proceeds through the system." Bill knelt slowly, allowing Rex to approach and inspect him at his own pace. The dog's behavior revealed his training, cautious but methodical assessment, maintaining awareness of his surroundings while focusing on the potential threat or ally before him. After a thorough examination, Rex offered a tentative tail wag, not friendship yet, but acknowledgement of Bill's non-threatening status. "He's got good instincts," Bill observed, carefully extending his hand for Rex to sniff. "Mercy, come say hello. Puppies stay." Mercy approached with dignified restraint, her manner conveying both authority and reassurance to the newcomer. The two dogs engaged in the complex ritual of canine introduction, circling, sniffing, subtle shifts in ear and tail position, communicating volumes in a language humans could only partially interpret. What Bill could read clearly, however, was the gradual relaxation in Rex's posture, the slight lowering of his guard in recognition that he was among his own kind here, not just physically, but experientially. Mercy had endured similar traumas, carried similar burdens, emerged similarly scarred but unbroken. "They understand each other," Dr. Winters remarked softly. Bill nodded, watching as Mercy eventually led Rex toward the shade of a large oak tree, establishing a comfortable distance where both could observe the surroundings while processing this new development. The puppies remained where Bill had instructed, though their whines of curiosity made clear they were eager to investigate the newcomer. "All in good time," Bill told them, understanding that proper introductions would need to proceed at Rex's pace, not the puppy's enthusiasm. Reynolds approached, having given Bill space to manage the initial meeting. "Well, what do you think of our first official client?" Bill studied Rex thoughtfully. "He's hypervigilant but responsive. Good candidate for rehabilitation." He turned to Reynolds with a knowing look. "You're not really giving me a choice about this program, are you?" Reynolds had the grace to look slightly chagrined. "Colonel Winters believed you'd say yes once you saw the need firsthand. Rex is just the first. We've identified 3 more dogs in similar situations, witnesses to crimes or carrying evidence, handlers compromised, traditional channels potentially unsafe." Bill shook his head, not truly annoyed, but recognizing the skilled manipulation for what it was. "Margaret always said I was a sucker for a dog with sad eyes and a job to do." "Smart woman, your wife," Dr. Winters commented with a smile. "Rex's physical wounds have healed, but his psychological ones need more time. Conventional kennels can't provide what he needs, and civilian adoption isn't an option given his connection to an ongoing investigation." Bill looked from Rex to Mercy, then to the puppies watching attentively from their designated spot, and finally to Thomas's letter still waiting in his pocket. Pieces of a life he hadn't anticipated assembling themselves into a future he couldn't have imagined when he woke that stormy morning 6 months ago with only thoughts of ending, not beginning. "I'll need help," he said finally. "Proper staff, resources. Can't run a facility like this alone." Reynolds nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Already in the works. Thomas's security expertise, Sarah's veterinary studies, Dr. Winters' continued involvement, plus military support staff as needed." He extended his hand. "So we're official?" Bill clasped it firmly, the decision feeling less like a new commitment and more like an acknowledgement of a path already chosen. "We're official. When do we start?" "You already have," Dr. Winters said, gesturing to where Mercy had gently nudged Rex into a more relaxed position in the shade. "That right there is exactly what this program is about. Healing through understanding that can only come from shared experience." As if to underscore her point, the smallest puppy, Taylor, had quietly detached from his siblings and was cautiously approaching the 2 adult dogs. His movement caught Rex's attention, triggering a momentary tension that Mercy immediately addressed with a soft whine of reassurance. Taylor paused at a respectful distance, then lowered himself to his belly in a non-threatening posture that seemed remarkably mature for his age. Bill watched with pride as his youngest charge demonstrated an intuitive understanding of what the traumatized newcomer needed, not exuberant welcome, but patient acceptance. After several minutes of this careful standoff, Rex's posture softened further. He extended his muzzle slightly toward Taylor, an invitation the puppy accepted with deliberate calm, moving forward to complete the introduction with a respectful touch of noses. The moment crystallized everything the proposed facility represented: rehabilitation through connection, healing through community, purpose through service to others who carried similar wounds. It offered not just a future for Bill, but a legacy that honored both his military service and Margaret's compassionate spirit. As the autumn sun warmed the training yard, Bill Callahan stood surrounded by the unexpected family that had found him on what should have been his last day: Mercy with her hard-won wisdom, the puppies with their boundless potential, and now Rex with his wounded trust seeking restoration. Soon, if Reynolds' plans proceeded, Thomas and Sarah would join this circle, bridging the human connections that had frayed in the aftermath of loss. Margaret had been right, as she so often was. Life had found a way to continue, not as an echo of what was lost, but as something new, different, yet equally meaningful. The path forward would not be without challenges. Harrington's death indicated that powerful forces still moved in the shadows, threats remained, and vigilance would be necessary for the foreseeable future. But for perhaps the first time since receiving that terminal diagnosis in Margaret's hospital room 3 years ago, Bill Callahan found himself looking toward tomorrow with genuine anticipation rather than dread. Each sunrise now brought not just obligation, but opportunity. A chance to help another wounded warrior find their way back from darkness, to transform trauma into purpose, to build something that would outlast him. It was, he reflected as he felt Thomas's letter in his pocket, a future worth living for. Life has a way of finding us, even when we've given up searching. Like Bill Callahan, many of us have faced that dark morning when purpose seems lost, when retirement feels like an ending rather than a beginning, when loved ones leave us behind, when our bodies remind us daily of time's passing. But sometimes, salvation arrives in unexpected forms. Perhaps it's not a wounded German shepherd and her puppies for you, but that moment of grace is waiting. A grandchild who needs your wisdom, a community cause that needs your experience, or perhaps even a four-legged companion who sees value in you that you've forgotten to see in yourself. The beauty of our generation is that we carry decades of hard-won wisdom and resilience. We've weathered storms that would have broken others. Remember, your story isn't over until you decide it is. The chapters ahead might be the most meaningful ones yet. What unexpected second chance has changed your life course? Or what are you still hoping might find its way to your door? Share your story below. Someone else might find the hope they need in your words.